factoring a multivariate polynomial by grouping. If we're asked to factor a polynomial, we have several options available to us. If the polynomial has two terms, then we can check to see, is it a difference of squares, is it a sum or difference of cubes. If a polynomial has three terms, we can try to factor it into a product of binomials. However, if a polynomial has four terms, as this one does, then we really only have one technique available to us, and that is to try to factor it by grouping. Factoring by grouping, the technique behind factoring by grouping is to group the polynomial, the four terms, into two pairs of two terms each, and to see and to try to factor those and to see if there's a common factor. It's a little bit easier to see than to explain, so let's take a look and see how this works. So here is a polynomial, and it has four terms. So the only technique I have for this is to try to factor by grouping. I'm going to try to group these two together, and I will group these two together, and I will look to see if there's a common factor. So between 16x and xw, there is a common factor of x, so I'll pull that out, and then what's left is 16 plus w. And we have to be a little bit careful here because of the minus sign. So this is like a plus, and don't forget the minus is with the 8, so this is like minus 8x squared minus 2w. So in this case, I'm probably going to want to factor out a minus because there's a negative sign here and here. That's a minus. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out a minus 2 because I can do that from each one. So I'm going to factor out a minus 2, and then what's left is 4x squared plus w. Now, if I did this correctly, what we should see is that this binomial here and this binomial here matches, and so we can factor it out. In this case, it does not match, so that means that we grouped this in a way that did not help us. So let's try this again with a different grouping. So I'm going to group the 16x with the negative 8x squared, and I'll group the xw with the minus 2w. So 16x plus, it's a little bit easier for me if I write this, if I write the negative as plus negative 8x squared. And then I have plus xw, that's a w, minus 2w. So here again, I'm going to group these together, and I'm going to group these together. What can I factor out here? I can factor out an 8x. So I'll factor out my 8x, and then I get 2 minus x plus, what can I factor out of here? I can factor out a w, and I get x minus 2. This looks a little bit better, but you notice that these two binomials are not exactly the same. However, they are almost exactly the same. They only differ by the sign. Now, each term is the opposite sign. Each term is the opposite sign in the binomial. Positive 2, negative x, positive x. That means that I can change the sign by factoring out a negative 1. So I could factor out a negative 1 out of this term, or I could factor out a negative 1 out of this term. It would change the signs. X minus 2 is a little bit more comfortable than 2 minus x, but it doesn't really matter. I'm going to factor out a negative 1 out of this, so a negative 1, and that will change the signs, x minus 2, and I still have my 8x here, plus w times x minus 2. Now notice that these match, and so I can factor that out. I'm going to factor out my x minus 2, and then what's left is negative 8x and w plus w, and that would be factored. Now, if you don't like to start with, if you don't like this negative 8x here, you can rewrite that. That's the same thing as x minus 2 times w minus 8x. It doesn't really matter. And we can check ourselves if you want to by multiplying, by distributing this through. X times w is xw, That's this term. Negative 2 times w is negative 2w. That's this term. X times 8x, negative 8x is negative 8x squared. That's this term. Negative 2 times negative 8x is positive 16x. That's this term. And so this is the correct factorization because when I multiply it, I get the original polynomial back.